This morning we are going to talk about Asia's oldest surviving religion. But before I do that, there are a couple of other things that are going to be a prelude to it. The first one is to talk about civilization. The word suggests that it has something to do with towns or cities. And indeed, civilizations are often taken to have begun when cities began. What would cause that? Well, of course, it would be the shortage of land. When you have a growing society in a river plain, a large river plain, as you would have in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, in the Nile, there's a point where the population gets large enough for people to be competing for land. And so you start to have authority over the distribution of land and a system of settling border disputes. And now, of course, that could happen in tribes as long as the tribes are separated from each other. But when you get in an expanding population on a river, you start to get the situation where the tribes are overlapping and beginning to butt up against each other, and so you have the risk of warfare. Now, in order to try and control people from endless fighting over land, a central authority is eventually established. The central authority taking the form of a ruler who is agreed to by all the competing parties, and the ruler is often chosen from the priesthood. So some of the earliest rulers were actually priest kings or priest rulers. Eventually it becomes hereditary, and you get hereditary royalty, hereditary kingships. Now, naturally, the territory involved is fairly large. It involves a large number of tribes, 10 or 20 tribes. And so you need administration, particularly to settle all the border disputes and the other disputes. So the administration needs a place to work and a place to live, and they're not really related to farming or pastoral activities. They're related to the ruler. And so you need a larger town than you would have had before, a larger settlement, where you can accommodate all these officials and the lawmakers and the law distributors. And so you start to get the growth of cities, and then associated with cities, of course, you get the growth of patronage, the growth of culture, the growth of large religious establishments, and the whole city begins to get larger and larger. And that is generally taken to be the moment when civilization develops. Most of the books will tell you that civilizations began in ancient Egypt and in Mesopotamia. But now there is new evidence coming up all the time to suggest that civilizations began in other places as well at about the same time. It's all around the end of the 3rd and 4th millennium BC. And in this period you have now evidence of civilization developing in East Asia, probably in northern Vietnam around the Red River, slightly earlier than further north. And then in the Indus Valley in India, what is now Pakistan, but the Indus Valley. And then, of course, around the Black Sea too, which is still all very much in debate and in dispute. So it all took off at about the same time, apparently. But certainly the Indus Valley civilization, which was thought to be rather younger, is now assumed to be about as old as the Mesopotamian civilization and the Egyptian. And of course that is the origin of Indian culture. But the difficulty is, because we didn't have writing then, we now don't understand the Indian culture as it was in the Indus Valley. It is very difficult to comprehend it. If we look at the first slide, here is one of the typical bas-reliefs, engravings that we have from that society. And this is actually the form of a seal, which could be made with wax. And it's clearly a god of some kind, and apparently the god has horns, but the writing along the top cannot be deciphered. And a huge amount of effort has been put into deciphering it, and until the present day nobody can understand it. It's assumed to be the name of the god, since it's not regarded as a packing list for shipping goods from one place to another. It must be a designation, but nobody can make any sense of it at all. And so we simply don't know the connection between this image, which is apparently a god, and the later gods of Hinduism. We don't know the connection, and it's very speculative what the connection might be. It's very tempting, by the way, to make connections with Shiva, but absolutely speculative. No proof that there is any connection. Similarly, we don't know what happened to the people of the Indus civilization. We know that they built big cities. We don't quite know why the cities came to be abandoned, although we're beginning to understand in the modern world how that can happen. A combination of disease and climate change and all sorts of unpredictable natural phenomena. And these rivers could easily flood and inundate the cities. So it's a combination of these factors probably that caused the abandonment of the cities in the Indus Valley. But it may also be invasion, foreign invasion, and that is one factor which is speculated about, because with the flooding of the Black Sea, which is now more or less accepted to have happened, although exactly how it happened is debatable, whatever the cultures were around the Black Sea became spread out, and the people started to move, and they caused other people to move. And so we get a great movement of people beginning in the 6th millennia BC and going on for 3 millennia after that, and ending up with the migrations into Europe and the migrations into Asia. We know that some of the people in Malaya were foreign invaders. We know that a lot of the people in India were foreign invaders, the Aryans. And they had spread right across Asia. And similarly, the Aryans, as you know, spread into Europe. And the time of the spread into India is in dispute, but it's probably about 1,500 BC, up to 1,000 perhaps. And it seems to have been a major set of invasions. The advantage that these people had, the Aryans, or sometimes called the Indo-Europeans, the advantage they had was that they rode horses and had trained themselves to be very skillful warriors on horseback. And this was, of course, something that didn't exist in these peaceful river valleys. And so they could not be defeated in any way, these warriors. And so they simply swept everything before them. The fact that the people who invaded Europe were linked to the people who invaded India and Malaya is demonstrated by the similarity of the languages to this day. So ancient Latin and the languages developed from it, ancient Greek, the ancient Sanskrit and Pali languages in India, other languages in Central Asia and Malaya, they all can be shown to be linked together, usually by the most common words being very similar. Mother, mama, words like that, papa, such words are very common in those languages. So sometime around 1600, 1500 BC, we get a decline and then an extinction of the Indus Valley civilization. You can see the Indus River running up through what is now Pakistan, above Gujarat. Over on the right, there's another great river starting up in the Himalayas and running over towards Calcutta. That's the Ganges. We don't have much evidence that the Ganges saw the development of the Indus Valley culture. But we have to understand that archaeology is very hit and miss and very young. So it may well prove that there was a link between developments in the Ganges and developments in the Indus. However, once the Indo-Europeans invaded northern India, they focused, their culture became focused on the Ganges River. And the Ganges River became the center of great cities from about 800 BC. What happened to the people who were the very civilized and indeed highly civilized people who belonged to the Indus Valley culture is highly disputable, but probably they were driven south. That's the most likely explanation of where they went. And so they may have ended up in southern India as the Dravidian people. And there are many scholars who speculate that ancient Indus languages were related to Dravidian, modern Dravidian, in the south. That is the Tamil people and related cultures. Now, an idea of how civilized the Indus Valley people were comes from looking at their architecture. Well, to begin with, their towns, because their towns were laid out on grid patterns with straight streets, very ordered. Wide streets for the main streets, narrow streets for the side streets and the back streets. And then the buildings in those building blocks, were also highly organized. As you will see when we look at Hindu houses later on, there's a definite relationship, we feel there's a relationship, between the architecture of the Indus Valley houses and that of the later Hindu houses. Look at the perfectly square courtyard, which we'll come back to later. And then it's a double-story building with an upper floor and a lower floor. And obviously the more important rooms would have been upstairs. So the lower levels would have been the service level. And it's clear there were top lights. One can work out from the archaeology where the wooden members were because they leave a mark, of course, in the structures in brick and in plaster. So the notches in which the wooden members were placed are very clear in the archaeology. So it's possible to reconstruct the wooden constructions. We haven't time now to go into it, but if you ever looked at photographs of the excavations in the Indus Valley of these great cities, you'd see how much is left. There's an amazing amount left. Many of the buildings are standing up to 15 or 20 feet high because they were inundated by mud. So instead of going on with that, which is purely speculative and not terribly relevant to what we're talking about today, I want to move on to the question of the religion and its influence on architecture. Hinduism, as we know it today, can be traced back to the writings of religious books. Like everything else, that's in dispute, but writing seems to have been very early in India, about the 8th or 9th century BC. And so we have a series of books called the Rig Veda, which give us an idea of religious beliefs at that period. These books are books about the legends of the development of the society through warfare. And they're very fanciful. They're filled with interventions from the gods. They're very similar in many ways to the early writings of the Battle of Troy, the Greek legends. They're very close. But what they do give you an understanding of is the way in which religion was practiced at the dawn of written history in India. And that is that it was about sacrifice. It was about human sacrifice. Sacrifice, of course, of precious animals in the early phase, as in all religions. And it was polytheistic, that is, there were many gods, but there was one creator god. All of the Indian gods tended to be in a form which was close to human form, but not the creator god. He was never represented. The great god Brahman. And the point of the sacrifice was to align yourself with what the gods represented. And what the gods represented for these ancient people, and it has continued throughout history in India, was the association of the material world with the spiritual world. As human beings, we are born essentially material. We have a relatively small spiritual component in our makeup. But the great spiritual experience of the world is something we only have access to if we make a great effort, if we make a sacrifice to try and align ourselves with the spiritual dimension of the eternity. So, while accepting perpetual change as part of life and part of experience, the Hindus also regarded a perpetual, endless eternity of alignment between material and spiritual experience as being the essence of truth. That was the essence of what we should understand as the divine world outside us. So that world can be reached through law, through acting righteously and valuing the good above the evil, but it can also be reached, and has to be reached, through religious belief and religious activity. And so ritual and sacrifice became fundamental to the Hindu belief. And so they're trying to reach the unitary principle which governs the whole universe. Hinduism, like all religions, becomes modified with the passage of time. Sacrifice becomes less important in a very material, fundamental way. So the sacrifice of animals began to disappear by about the 4th century BC and was replaced more by human beings making a personal sacrifice through fasting, through giving gifts to the gods, through sacrificing material pleasures. So this kind of evolution in the religion took place. And that evolution went on in Hinduism, so that you get a phase in which they no longer regard the gods as being creatures who will intervene to help them, but rather as being superior creatures, and their recognition of the importance of the superior creatures is part of recognizing the unity of everything in creation. And so, in order to achieve unity and harmony with this whole creation, man has to turn inside, to look inside himself. And it becomes a question of personal sacrifice, personal improvement to achieve salvation. Now, what would salvation be for a Hindu? It would be to avoid being born again. The great fear ancient Indians had was that rebirth would end up with them declining in their material harmony with the universe, becoming lesser creatures. So they might be reborn as animals or reborn even as insects. And so they were trying to escape this eternal reincarnation. And so the ultimate aim of religion for a Hindu became to so align yourself with the spiritual dimension of the universe that you didn't have to be reborn. You escaped it. And that becomes true of Buddhism too. The great goal of the religion and of religious devotion is to escape reincarnation. There were later religious books which were developed in India, notably the Upanishads, which were developed in the period around 2nd century BC, and a bit later perhaps. And the Upanishads are dealing very much with the issue of reincarnation and what has to be done in order to try and control it. In this period, since most of the gods are devalued to the extent that you cannot really ask them to intervene, at this period the prayers are going mainly to Brahma, the great creator God, who in the end is the supreme being who controls everything. Now, I have explained that the religion evolved, but of course, like all religions, some people go back to the beginnings. So you have Hindus to this day who regard the Vedas as the sacred texts. You have Hindus who regard the Upanishads as the sacred texts. Then you have the evolution of later texts. And you don't have one type of Hinduism, you have hundreds of types, just as you have hundreds of types of Christianity and hundreds of types of Protestantism, some more important than others. So it's very difficult to generalize about Hinduism. This is particularly true when we come to the last phase of evolution, which was the phase in which the importance of love became emphasized. And this is a late phase, somewhere around the 8th century AD to 10th or 11th century AD. And there the great vehicle of love was Krishna. And so the idea of creating harmony in the universe through love and compassion became the overriding principle in the worship of many Hindus. Now, I've tried to summarize that a little bit in the handout. I'd like to begin by going to the theology on the second page first. The universe is whole and indivisible. That is, the material universe and the spiritual universe are one. And the spiritual universe is all things immaterial. That is breath, life, experience, ecstasy, and love. And the spiritual universe is everywhere around us, and there is nothing material, no material dimension to it. The spiritual state can only be totally reached by renunciation and return. So Hinduism, if we go to the top of that second page, Hinduism from the point of view of ordinary people has three principles. Now again, you must bear in mind I'm talking about the most commonly held beliefs of the Hindus. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of other kinds of belief. But here is the most dominant belief of Hindus. Three principles: love, kindness, assisting others. Then the offerings are made to the gods, usually in the form of food today, as a way of hoping for blessings. One can make the offerings to specific gods who might be concerned with childbirth or with harmony in life or with success in warfare, but one doesn't necessarily believe that you will persuade them to help you, but you make the offering anyway in the hope of getting some benevolence. Singing becomes very important in the religious rituals because they believe that gods are more likely to listen to singing than they are to speech. And then the temples themselves become symbols of the characteristics of particular gods. On the first page, I have a discussion of the evolution of Hinduism, which I've just gone through quickly. And we see that passionate devotion and love with Krishna becomes quite late. I've said here from 500 AD. It's altogether very debatable. I said 800, but it may be earlier. The idea of nobility I haven't stressed, and that, of course, is a very early and important phase in the evolution of the religion. The cult of nobility, the human cult of honesty, dignity, truth. These become major issues in daily behavior of a devout Hindu. Well, it's a very difficult thing to discuss, as you can see, but I've tried to get an introduction to it. So let's now go, and you'll find more discussion of Hinduism in the readings I've given you and in the library. Now go and look at a Hindu building. Now, one of the ways in which we study architectural tradition is to look for marginalized communities where on the borders of a culture you still have some relics of early architecture and early life. And they tend to be more ancient than the evidences you would get from the big cities or the centers of culture. So in the case of Hinduism, a very good area to look is the rural districts of India, which many scholars are doing, or overseas developments, of which the most obvious one would be in Ceylon, which is now called Sri Lanka, which was an island off the South Indian coast, which had Hindu communities about 2000 BC, but which we know very little history, we have very little understanding. But those Hindu communities were not the most important communities in the island. They were just small communities which were trading. And therefore, they were not terribly rich, they didn't develop much, and the architecture tends to be hundreds of years old. So here is a house 300 years old, a little bit more, built in the 17th century. And one is able to study what the traditions would be like in this very old society. It's in the north of Sri Lanka, in Jaffna. It's the house of a successful farmer and merchant, a fairly important family. It's a fairly big house. It's not a cottage. And we are approaching it from outside. First thing to notice, it's single-storied. It has a big roof. We're approaching one wing of a courtyard house, and we're going to go inside. When you go in, you find you're in an office. This is open to the public. This is where the owner of the house would do his business, meet all his employees, deal with foreigners and outsiders who are doing business with him. It is completely closed off from the rest of the house by a single door. At my request, the owner opened the door to allow a glimpse into the courtyard. But normally that door would be firmly closed, and a visitor would not have any chance of seeing the life behind it. Here he is. Again, another view into the courtyard. But if you are very privileged, you would be allowed into the courtyard. Now, normally, you would only be allowed in if you were of exactly the same caste, that is, the same level of sophistication in society, and therefore the house would be open to you. But anybody who was of another caste would not be allowed in, and certainly no foreigner like me would be allowed in. The owner explained to me that after I had been allowed into this courtyard, he would have to spend 3 days purifying himself and the courtyard and all the inhabitants of the house. So here is the courtyard, and the door we've come out of is over on the right-hand edge. So that is the door of the office. Courtyard is paved, and around it is a raised platform all the way around, the other 3 sides. And this raised platform has been screened, mostly in 100 years ago or so, but it shouldn't really have many screens. The screens are hiding the area where the girls in the family slept. And the main living area is over on the right-hand side, and I'll show you in the plan where that is. Here is the office we came into, the single door, the courtyard, a perfect square, and here are the 2 screens hiding where the girls slept there. So let's start talking about the plan. Well, I've already told you the courtyard area is sacred, is a purified area. So the building is fundamentally a shrine for worship. It's a house, but it's also a shrine for worship. And that is important because in the morning and in the evening, at dawn and at dusk, the whole family is assembled in the courtyard to pray their daily prayers towards Brahma and the household gods. And they do that standing here and facing the shrine, which is here, which is linked to the courtyard by a ramp through the raised platform. Now, the house, therefore, is a shrine, a religious shrine, and that is expressed by the fact that the courtyard is a perfect square. Of course, it would be even more aligned to the forces of the spiritual world, the cosmos, perhaps, if it was a perfect circle. But that's not easy to do when you're building in wood. And in any case, this is a very permanent structure in solid materials. And many of the materials are, because it evolved in floodplains, are not materials which are just wood. They have materials using brick and clay. And so the square is the next most perfect shape to the circle. And there's an implied circle inside it, as you'll see when we look at the mandala. All right, so now we've had one element in the house which is outside of the courtyard, and that is the office. There's another element which is outside of the courtyard, and you can see there's a single door again, and clearly this is a separate area. And this, of course, is the area for the servants, for the cooking, for all the household necessary activities to maintain the house. I said that the main living area is here. The main area for the husband and his wife is here, and that's where they sleep. The boys sleep here, and any activities or any farm materials are brought in here. And this becomes a material store and a farm implement store with a single door here out to the farm. Next to the shrine, there are 2 other rooms, obviously aligned with it and associated with it. This one is called the dark room. And it's the dark room because it has only a tiny source of light. And The dark room is the room which women could use for their private life and their private activities. It's a tiny room though, and of course it's the room for childbirth. The other room has no window at all and is simply a storeroom for ritual vessels. You might think it's strange that a house would have ritual vessels, but then somewhere they have to have a wedding feast and a feast to celebrate the birth of a child. And in those feasts they have huge vessels which are brought into the courtyard, and all of the people who are relatives and close friends in the same caste come together in the courtyard to celebrate these events. And so the ritual vessels, which are often 4 or 5 feet across and 3 or 4 feet deep, they are kept in there. There's one other room which seems very strange because it's a proper room and quite large. This is the room for the religious man who comes to officiate at certain ceremonies in the house, the Swami. And they have to provide a room for him to change in and to sleep in. Over here is the activity of preparing food and some stores, a rice bin on stilts, and a fire in the corner here, which is used for cooking vegetables, and fruit, but not meat. Meat is not cooked anywhere, even in this ancillary area. Meat is cooked outside in a fire here. Water is drawn over there, and fire is on this side. And the access of the building from the shrine is through there. So if one is in the shrine looking down the axis, you have water on the right-hand side and fire on the left-hand side. The axis must look from towards either the south or the east, and cannot look in any other direction. Why? Because west would be the sunset. So if your axis is facing towards the sunset, your house is facing towards death, isn't it? And dying. To face towards life, it has to face towards the sun, so either east or south. Well, let's look at the section. The highest roof, naturally, is over the shrine and the 2 associated rooms. And the lowest roofs are out here. So the whole building, it's a private house, but the whole building is actually a religiously conceived shrine. Interesting, isn't it? They don't think of a temple and a house as being separate building types, just one is bigger than the other. Now here is the modern state of the living area of the house. Naturally, they've tried to put in some furniture and some books, and it's got away from the simplicity a bit. And here we're looking again at the door from the office into the courtyard. And next to it, you remember, is the room that the Swami stayed in, the religious leader. And that's the way through to the kitchen. Here's the way, the approach to the shrine up the ramp from the courtyard. These are the images of the shrine, including a great candle. And of course, all precious documents are kept in the shrine as well. Notice the suggestion of a lamp on either side to show how important it is. And that would be the view one would have when one was praying. You stand in the courtyard looking at the door of the shrine. Looking from the shrine across the courtyard to the passageway through to the kitchen. And that's looking from the kitchen across the courtyard at the approach to the shrine. And here we are in the kitchen. We're looking, of course, into the area of the preparation of food, and the fire was made over in the bottom right-hand corner. Here we are looking from outside into the kitchen court. You notice there was no toilet, no bathroom. That all happens outside. Bathing, of course, is done around the well. Here is the well outside the kitchen. And toilet is out in the fields, out in the woods around the house. In modern terms, of course, they have built toilets outside, but they're out well beyond the boundary of the house. There's only one other activity to mention, and that is purification of the house, which involves bathing in salt and a number of other sacrifices. And the fact that any activity which is thought to pollute the purity of the house has to happen outside, which means that girls who are menstruating have to sleep on benches outside next to the kitchen in order not to purify, not to pollute the purity of the house. Now, when you come to talk about temples, religious buildings in India, they are actually of many types, and it's quite hard to simplify it. But I'd like to simplify it in this way by saying that there is a southern temple type and a northern temple type. The thing that characterizes both types is the attempt to build a sacred mountain. The difference between the two is that the sacred mountain to the southerners was something material, and therefore could not be at the center of the shrine. And indeed, the southern temple tends to have a courtyard as the center of the shrine. The northern temple, however, has a sacred mountain as the center of the shrine. Big difference. I'll show you the difference now. Now, this is a very old, early example of a northern temple type at a place called Mahabalipuram, just south of what was Madras, now Chennai in India. And it's, again, variously dated, but it's probably from the 7th century to 8th century AD. And it's very easy to analyze it because it's designed as a perfect square, and it has 4 stories. The top story has a great roof, which is a kind of domed roof, but obviously representing something that was originally built in a soft material, perhaps thatch. And this great shrine at the top would be the shrine of the creator god, wouldn't it? The highest of all divinities, Brahma. And that's the only way he's ever represented, by a great domed shrine like that. He's never represented it any other way. And then the first set of divinities created by Brahma is on the next level. And these are the most famous Indian divinities: Vishnu, Shiva, and so on. Below them are their attendants, their spouses, their companions, and also their vehicles. Now, because in the material world of the Hindus, all creative material things are one, animals become deities in their own right. And so the vehicles of the great gods are also deities in a way, and are represented here. Each one of them has its own shelter, its own shrine, in the form of a little transverse roof. And then, of course, there are the children of the great gods, and so it goes on endlessly, but it's only represented as having taken place on the 4th level, the bottom level here, as the number of gods proliferates out from the great creator god. So it's simply a symbolic representation of divinity on many levels. And underneath it, a small cave. This is carved in natural rock, so underneath is a small cave, which is the sanctuary. And into that cave would only go the priests. And the prayer of the ordinary citizens would be outside, looking at the temple from outside. And there's a diagram of it. Now what the diagram is indicating is that if you project these 4 levels down to the ground, you create a diagram, a sacred diagram, of 4 concentric squares, in which the central square represents the creator god, the second square represents the major gods, and so on to the outer edges, where you get the fusion of many minor gods. And that's called a mandala, that diagram, and is a representation of the ritual that is meant to take place when you pray. You approach the minor gods, the minor divinities and the vehicles, and you move through towards the great creator God in your final devotion. Now you don't only get mandalas for gods, you get mandalas for the creation of human beings. And the most famous of those is the Purusha mandala, and here is the Purusha mandala for the creation of man. And of course the most important part of the creation of man is the navel, where the birth is thought to take place, and associated to the navel, the genitals. And then in the second layer, or on the second square, you have the main limbs, the chest and the lower part of the head, and then the rest of the body is an ancillary around the outside edge. Now that was the northern Indian conception, and I'll come back to that in a moment by showing you many examples of it. But here is the southern Indian conception, and this may or may not relate to the Indus Valley civilization if you believe that the southern Indians were pushed south by the Indo-Aryan invasion. And there are many reasons for thinking there's a relationship between what has been found of temples in the Indus Valley and these temples which are still in use in southern India. Notably that one of the most important features is a great ablution pool, a very large pool. Also that the most important space in the temple is not a tower, but a courtyard in the middle. And in the courtyard is a tiny building, which is the shrine, as modest as it could possibly be. The sacred mountain is represented as being a material thing related to the material world, and so it is represented a number of times in the major gateways. As the temple is enlarged, then the outer gateways get bigger and the sacred mountain gets higher. Each one of those is called a gopura, or a gopuram, and we have, as you see, in a big temple like these, a huge number of activities going on, including music, sacred dance, places for meditation, sermons, but in the center, a very simple shrine in a very plain courtyard. As you can see in that diagram, the shrine in this case is actually circular in the middle, not square. And you notice that the axis from left to right is actually axial, right through the building. So you go from one gate to another gate, to another gate, to another gate. In medieval times, the outer areas were actually used also for markets and for some commercial activities. But later on, they were expelled. And here is one of the outer gateways. Now, having seen what a sacred mountain was meant to be like in the shrine at Mahabalipuram, you can see that this is basically the same sort of symbolism, but just on a larger scale. And because it's a gateway, it's an elongated building, a transverse elongated building. So you have the great shrine of Brahma at the top is now elongated, but it's still a single shrine. Whereas all the others down below are multiple shrines and multiplying in number as you go down the height of the gateway. And there we are going on the axis, looking as we go from one gateway to another. And the most outer gateway in this case is actually colonial. And here we are looking the other way, inward towards the cellar, a series of gateways going through an immense amount of activity. You will pass dance, you'll pass music, you'll pass some people selling things, giving away offerings, and you come, of course, to the Great Ablution Pool. And now we're getting into the inner sanctum. This is the second row, second rank of the mandala before we get to the central court. And here you have a great number of pavilions for dance, for sermons, for music. And finally to the inner sanctum, where this very simple building, which originally had a thatched roof, now covered with gilded tiles, it represents the inner sanctum, the most sacred part of the building, and is as humble as could be, as non-material as could be. So that is the characteristic southern temple, whereas that is the characteristic northern temple. We're back to Mahabalipuram again. And here is a development out of that also at Mahabalipuram, the shore temple, one of a number of them, in which they start to accentuate the height of the sacred mountain, and they added ancillary shrines to it. Notice how in the Mahabalipuram shore temples, the great shrine of Brahma becomes even more dominant, doesn't it? And of course the same is true as that kind of temple is made even larger as time goes on. So now we've moved from Mahabalipuram to a northern temple, which is actually even a little bit further south in Tanjore. And there you can see the great shrine of Brahma on the top of the sacred mountain, and then all the divinities below. In this case, dozens of them, if not hundreds. But what is added in Tanjore is a square room in front, which is a room in which privileged worshippers can gather and watch sacred dancing and listen to sacred music. Only the priests are allowed inside the shrine, which is under the center of the sacred mountain. But the worshippers are allowed to circumambulate around it, also under the sacred mountain. So if we now look at the plan, I believe, you'll see that. So here is the original building for the worshippers to occupy during a service. Here is a sanctuary for a special area for priests, and there is, of course, the sacred cellar, which only the priests could enter. But during the service, there could be an ambulation around the shrine by the worshippers. And here is a further extension to the public area to allow more worshippers to watch sacred dance and music. And of course there are some other ancillary shrines. Notice the geometry of the whole thing. It's very important and carefully worked out. We'll discuss that again in a moment. But I wanted to talk a bit more about this structure here. This is a mast, a sort of symbol at the entrance as you come through into the entrance court. And this great mast is thought to be part of the reading of the temple mandala as a Purusha mandala as well. A Purusha mandala perhaps related to divinity, in which they assume that this is the kernel of generation, these are ancillary parts, and these are the genitals. And so there is often some sort of a sexual symbol there. If it's a symbol for the male god, like Shiva, it will be a phallus, very symbolic, abstract. Or it could be a symbol, if it's for a female divinity, a symbol of something which is flat and low with a hole or slit in the middle. And so a symbol of a vulva. Now, as the temples get spread out into the forest lands further north, they start to be built in wood or in bamboo. And so we get a number of variations on the creation of a sacred mountain in those materials. And finally, we're now to the 11th, 12th centuries AD. You have the culmination of the design of these very tall, vertical Hindu temples in the north, along the Ganges particularly. This is in Khajuraho. And here there are 27 temples, all dating from 1 century. And these temples are all very vertical. You go up great flights of steps to go into them. They're sometimes flanked by shrines. And all of them have balconies which allow you to sit and watch a sacred dance and hear sacred musicians. They all have a very tall sacred mountain with a representation of Brahma and the Brahma dome on the top. And but they're all extremely vertical. And then they're decorated, richly decorated, with not only architectural decoration, but carvings as well. And that becomes very characteristic for Hindu temples as they spread all over the world. As you know, by that period, the emphasis was beginning to be on love and passion in worship. And so many of the statues along the sides are representing loving couples. Notice how the lower god shrines, the shrines of the lesser gods, are now still vertical, and they all have semi-dome roofs on them. And here we are at the approach to one of these temples, and we're going up the steps and into the outer balcony and through into the hall for the worshippers. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought we were going up it right away. We're not. We're looking at some of the decorations along the sides with loving couples. And also we're looking here at the great tower over the cellar and the representations of the lower divinities. And there you can see some of the gods and some of the acts of love going on around them. And so now we're going up our flight of steps inside the temple, and now we're in the one of the balconies looking across into the ambulatory around the central shrine. The central shrine is off to the left of this picture, so you're looking at the ambulatory on the right-hand side as it goes round. And it is also decorated and with many of these loving couples. And there you get some of this imagery, various divinities. To try and understand the architecture a little bit more, we have to help us some drawings that were made by architects 1.5 millennia ago, 1,500 years ago. And the reason they are so old is because these drawings come from the foundation vase that was placed in the ground when the temple was begun. And obviously you're not allowed to dig up that foundation vase from any temple that's still in use. So the only way you could get to them would be if the temple was already ruined completely. And so they've been able to dig up these from very early temples and see how the temple was designed. Because the drawing for the designing of the temple is buried in the vase, in the foundation. So you see here's one of the sacred mountains on its side at the bottom, but next to it you see the mandala for its design. It is a square with a circle in the middle and has 4 axes, and the central shrine is shown as a lotus. But what's really interesting is that's on the back of an ola leaf, which is a big flat leaf like a papyrus that they could draw on. But on the top, on the other side of it, is this calculation in mathematics. What is the calculation for? It seems to be for determining the way in which the proportioning system would work in the building. And it's derived from the mandala. And of course the image is a sketch, quick sketch of the dedicatory god. Now that's very clear evidence that mathematics and proportioning were terribly important in the design of these buildings. And so it's led a lot of modern scholars to analyze existing buildings in terms of mathematics and proportioning. There's one other bit of evidence, and that is that in the 18th century, when the British were ruling India and printing had been introduced, some of the Indian scholars were encouraged to try to transfer from the oleoleaves onto the printed page diagrams of the design of temple towers. And so we have these from these early books, which are also talking about the ratio, proportions of the various levels to each other. Notice how the god Brahma at the top gets a much larger proportion than the lowest of the gods at the bottom. So here is one such modern analysis of the proportioning systems that were being used and how they might relate to each other. Naturally, they're speculative. There's a dispute about how important they are, but I think nobody disagrees that the Hindu temples were designed on mandalas, that they were designed on some sort of a geometrical system, which is very regular. You can see the grid, and that the parts had a geometric relationship to each other. Going back to the house, what happens when you have a poor person running a shop in a big town, which is very dense, and you don't have much room to build a big, a comfortable house? Well, what happens is the house then becomes divided into 3 zones. The central zone, naturally, is the purified zone for the family. The zone furthest from the street would be the zone for the servants, not purified. And then the third zone would be the public zone for the sale of the goods in the front, the shop. And that would also not be purified. And then between them, you would have a single door. So a single door here and a single door there. And this is the shop. And it has its own little courtyard for light because it's such a narrow site. Then there's a bigger courtyard for the private part of the house. And then there's the servants' part up here as the third zone. In addition, there is sometimes an extra room on the roof, which becomes part of the purified zone and shows the way to a double-story building, which we'll come to in a moment. Another problem would be if you were designing on a steep hillside, and much of India is mountainous, so designing on steep hillsides is a problem. So when you look at the plan, again, it's not difficult to see 3 zones, and the central zone is the zone for the family and is purified. But when you look at the section on the right, then you can see that the whole thing is having to be stepped right down. So even the purified zone is on 2 different levels. Now, in a very tight situation, you may have the situation where the bottom is for the public and the top part is purified for the family. And so the upper part here has its own courtyard. Going back to this remote society in Sri Lanka, to a very old building, several hundred years old, and looking at a merchant's building there in the northern town of Jaffna. Obviously the outer veranda is for the storage of goods, and then you go behind it into a shop, and then you have a single door through into the family purified zone with its own court. Now, unfortunately, spoilt by having a mill built in the middle of the court. And then you have a rather large area for cooking and for service. And in this case, there seems to have been an overlap that allowed the family to also use some of this area, although it wasn't purified. It has a well in it. And then there's a yard at the back for animals. We'll have a look at that very quickly. So here we are in the street again with a typical bullock cart going past. Here we are in the what was the family zone, which now has this structure in the middle of the court. Again, looking the other way. And now we're out at the court at the back with the well in it, which has the kitchens just beyond. And we're looking at the well. And here is the kitchen with its grinding stones and its fire. And beyond that, the yard. So there's a very clear demarcation between the area that is used for household activities and workers and the area that is used for private family use, which is purified and is an area for devotion with a shrine. Now, what happens when you have a double-storied building? Now, this is a house of a rich merchant up in the north, and but because he is so important, he needs a lot of accommodation, and he has to have a double-storied building. So the way they solve that problem is to make the upper floor the purified zone, into which only people of the same caste or people who have been accepted as important guests are ever taken. And the lower part is for other people, including a room for foreign guests. Here you have the same sort of accommodation as we saw before. We have a men's room, we have a dark room, we have a kitchen over here, we have the main room for entertaining visitors and family, and a living room over here. And then down below you had that guest room, the main entrance, a storeroom here, rooms for activities in the main kitchen downstairs for dealing with the outsiders and for the workers in the shop. And there's a section through it. So the purified zone is the area of the veranda at the top and the rooms behind it. Now, Hinduism spread, not only into Sri Lanka, but into Nepal, Tibet, down into Burma, and then Malaya, and then in Indonesia, and then Indochina. So you had it in, of course, Cambodia and Thailand, Laos, and so on. And we ought to be talking about Hinduism there, but there is a slight problem, and I'll be dealing with that a little bit more next week. And that is that by the time Hinduism spread into that area, which was the early centuries AD, Buddhism had also spread there. And so Buddhism and Hinduism got mixed up in these areas. Not completely mixed, but they began to be two shades of the same kind of belief. And indeed, Buddhism does also believe in the totality of material and spiritual experience, and it's all one thing. And so there is a certain close bond between Hinduism and Buddhism. But what it meant in these areas is that the architecture begins to be partly Buddhist and partly Hindu. And so it's better to talk more about it next week. But let's just go a little bit into that. What is often clearly Hindu is the use of the tower, the sacred mountain, as a symbol over the cellar. So here we are in Indonesia with an example of that. Another one, but this one is from Cambodia. And of course, a famous example from Cambodia, Angkor Wat. A curious amalgam of the sacred mountain in the middle with the shrine of Brahma at the top, and then four repetitive motifs around the edge, which are rather like the Gopuram or gateway towers, and working in rather the same way, in that they're approached up flights of steps. So it's, again, a mixture of different influences, all in one building. So Hinduism becomes an extraordinarily broad religion in which anything is possible. You can accept ideas from Buddhism. You can accept ideas from other religions. Many Hindu temples today have the Virgin Mother and Infant Christ in the Hindu temple, in the shrine, as part of the worship. But Hinduism can accept any kind of worship. It's an amazingly tolerant, broad, wide religion. And so it's very difficult to generalize, as I've done in a few minutes about it. But what is true is that it is very broad in its influence, particularly in the first millennia AD. It spreads over most of Asia for a long time. And we are still discovering how broad that influence was. So we'll stop there. Are there any questions? I've gone through it very fast, but I hope you've got an impression of how it works. And the most interesting connection is between the house in which you live, which has become a purified sacred space, and the temple itself. All right, thank you very much.